Good morning and welcome back to the Center for Constitutional Studies annual First Amendment Conference. This conference is part of a multi-year celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in collaboration with Utah's America 250 Commission. I'm Colby Pena. I'm a student here at UVU and a Wood Research Assistant at the Center for Constitutional Studies. Our second session continues our examination of religious freedom in the American founding with a discussion of the relationship between religion and the Declaration of Independence. Our guides in this examination are two eminent scholars of American political thought. Owen Anderson is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. He is the author of the Declaration of Independence in God, Self-Evident Truths in American Law. Timothy Sandefur is Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Goldwater Institute and author of Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man. Moderating this exchange of ideas is Bradford P. Wilson. Bradford Wilson is the inaugural James Wilson Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Civic Thought in the Center for Constitutional Studies, and a recently appointed trustee of the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation. Please join me in welcoming this excellent panel.
Well, we decided we'd start it out this way with each of us giving a brief preface of our views of the relationship of God and the Declaration of Independence before proceeding on to our discussion. And I wanted to go first because I wanted to follow up on the comments Professor Smith made about covenant, because covenant is definitely one of the pervading images or archetypes on which the Declaration is founded. And I think it is important to understand that in order to understand my position. The Declaration of Independence is what we would today classify as a secular document. Why I couch it in that way and say what we would today classify is because the categorization of religious and secular that we take for granted today was only in its infancy at the time the Declaration was being written. And I don't think if you got in a time machine and went back in time and asked them that they would comprehend the distinction in the same sense that we do. The Declaration is written from a perspective of 18th century natural religion, a highly rational approach to religious questions that shuns such things as miracles or magic or mysticism or the supernatural, and says that our true understanding and our true reverence for God is found in our effort to understand by reason and science the order of the universe and to appreciate that order fundamentally. And it was natural, of course, for 18th century writers to employ the images that had been handed down from century after century of Christian tradition, such as covenant. I mean, these things were pervasive in their own education. It was how they naturally thought about things. They would have, you read their letters, they're quoting the Bible without attribution because they know that everybody's going to recognize their allusions because everybody's raised on the same books and has gone through the same basic education and draws from the same canon of thought. So it's natural that they would adopt a mechanism. Oh, and on top of that, of course, they're lawyers, right? And as lawyers, they're working in a common law tradition that has, its ancestry in the feudal era, which blends what we, again, today would separate as religious and secular, blends them inextricably. And so ideals like covenant, when it comes to, for instance, the king's covenant with his people, is that they owe him obedience in exchange for protection, so that when the king casts them out of his protection, that ends their need to obey, which is the whole argument of the Declaration. Well, this has its religious roots as much as its political roots in 18th century culture. So there's something anachronistic in asking whether the Declaration is a religious or a secular document. And I would put it this way. I would say, the linguists tell us that English is a language that employs Latin words in a German vocabulary, or maybe it's the other way around. And I would say that the Declaration does something similar. It employs a Christian vocabulary with a classical philosophical grammar. And by classical philosophical, I mean Greeks and Romans, right? We haven't talked about the Greek and Roman philosophical influence on the Declaration yet, which was every bit as profound, if not more so, than the Christian influence on the Declaration. For that reason, again, the Declaration is properly classified in today's terminology as a fundamentally secular document. But before I make that argument, I have to add another caveat, which is that today's version, the pervasive version of secularism in today's world, would find the Declaration incomprehensible. And the reason why is because the prevailing version of secular philosophy today employs a number of deeply flawed philosophical assumptions which were not held by the founders. They had a much more clear-eyed view of these things. And the one particular pea under the mattress is the notion of the is-ought gap. The so-called naturalistic fallacy, that there's something illicit about making a conclusion about how things ought to be from observations about how the world is. This is nonsense. Of course you can draw ought for value-based conclusions from a neutral, fact-based is sort of observation. There's no such thing as a naturalistic fallacy. And yet in today's world, most secularists simply believe this. And as a result, they think that moral claims are basically subjective, arbitrary, based on emotion. Our philosopher friends, our philosophy professor friends, they've moved on past this. They know that this is nonsense. They've rejected it long ago. But those of us in the legal community, I'm sorry to say, most lawyers still think that there's a rigid separation between is and ought. And for that reason, the Declaration's claims about there being natural moral truths is somehow unacceptable in the eyes of, I'm sorry to say, probably the vast majority of lawyers in today's world. If you put that aside, shove all that 20th century baggage aside, and you look at the Declaration with the ideas of Aristotle, Epicurus, Cicero in mind, you see that it makes a claim that is drawn from nature, not supernatural, but natural rights. That is simply human beings, living beings, have a certain quality, a distinctive characteristic that inanimate matter does not have, and that is they can be created and destroyed, which is not true of inanimate matter. And that's a fundamentally important distinction because it means that it makes rational sense to speak of things being good for or bad for living things, which is not true of inanimate matter. If you divide a rock in half, you have not done anything bad to the rock. In fact, you now have two rocks. If you divide Socrates in half, you no longer have Socrates, right? And so that means that it makes sense rationally to speak in evaluative or prescriptive terms about living beings, which you cannot do for non-living beings. And that, as I'm fond of telling students, the most important thing you can know about Aristotle and John Locke is that they were physicians. And therefore, it was natural for them to think of morality as a prescription for a kind of health, the moral or psyche, or the health of the psyche. And if you understand that approach to moral questions, you can see why the Declaration's claims about inalienable rights, self-evident truths, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is just an English phrase for flourishing, or eudaimonia in the ancient Greek, right? So you can see how this is a fundamentally secular claim in that it does not depend for its truth on God's willing it to be so. It's true the Declaration says the laws of nature and of nature's God. Nature's God in that phrase is playing the role of a historical explanation for those laws of nature, but that's all. Those laws of nature are laws, and that's what we're concerned about. We can debate where they come from some other day, is what the Declaration says. What we're concerned about is what those laws are and what they prescribe for humanity. Right? That's the focus. Now, well, I'll end on this note. The Declaration's vision of God as the lawgiver and law enforcer and supreme judge, right? The Declaration refers to God in legislative, executive, and judicial capacities because being a perfect being, he alone can properly exercise those things. Because God is this supreme lawgiver and law enforcer, it also denudes God of all of the characteristics that we traditionally associate with religion. That is, God has no real will. He is simply a maker and a follower of order. God is basically equated with order in the Declaration. And this is very fitting because in 1776, the worst possible thing you could call somebody in terms of politics, the biggest insult in politics was to say that it was arbitrary. Arbitrariness was the worst possible thing. That is, causeless, lacking an explanation, ipse dixit, because I say so. That's arbitrary. That's the worst possible thing. God would never act that way. God is therefore simply the order of the universe. Now, therefore, God plays a role in the Declaration, and yet it is the role of the Aristotelian prime mover, a sort of a God without a personality, basically without a will, who does not intervene in human affairs, who structures the universe and is the structure of the universe, and that's it. And that's why I say, in today's classification, we would call it a secular document, even though it is deeply imbued with the idea of an order that has been created by a supreme consciousness.
Well, thank you for inviting me and having me here and putting together this wonderful panel, which turned into a kind of a debate because we wanted to keep you awake before lunch. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a humble philosopher, but I'd like to present a different view of the Declaration of Independence, and specifically based on the idea that what the Declaration of Independence does is it gives the United States its official natural theology. So natural theology is what humans can know about God and human nature and good and evil just by studying creation. And that's in contrast to revealed theology, which is what we get from the scriptures. But in the world in which the Declaration of Independence was written, those aren't meant to be in conflict. Those are in unity. The God of nature is the same as the God of Scripture. Scripture has a different purpose than nature. Scripture's purpose is redemptive. And so although Scripture reiterates a number of the truths that you can know from creation about God and morality, it gives a different answer, or gives an answer to a different question. How can humans as sinners be redeemed? So we don't see that in the Declaration of Independence, but we do see something that's different than the pantheism that we just heard about, where God just is the laws of the universe, or Aristotelianism, where God is an impersonal being who is not aware of humans and doesn't care about them at all, is not even aware of anything except itself. We do have theism, Christian theism, and I'd like to make the case that this is because of how we should understand religion, the word religion. I think Troy pointed out, it's because we were talking beforehand about covenants. The problem in thinking about religion today, you think about a church being involved in a government document rather than ideas. But if religion is the particular answers that a people gives to basic questions about reality, like what is eternal and what is it to be a human, what is good and evil, then the government of any people is just the expression of that people's religion. There's not really this strong distinction then between religion and reason, except for that some religions maybe say that reason is insufficient or it doesn't help us. But the tradition in which the Declaration was written was a very strongly pro-reason tradition. So it would say we use reason to understand the Bible and write systematic theologies, just as well as we understand reason to understand creation, which is what it says about God and the world. And so the Declaration of Independence does something which I think is very perfect. It states in just one simple sentence an entire worldview. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And so it gives you an epistemology. There's some things that are self-evident. Now, that bothers philosophers. There's a lot of time on what does that mean to be self-evident. It's not self-evident in the same way that A is self-evident. People have doubted that God, the Creator, is real. But we can put that aside for now. We can talk about it in the discussion we want. But that's an epistemology, that there's some things that are so clearly true about God that we all disagree on them at the beginning. And then it gives a view of theology. What is eternal? God alone has existed from eternity. And God created, which is a willful act, humans. And by creating them, he gave them a nature. And when you have a nature, then you can begin to speak about what's good and evil for that nature, which is the point you made about the is-ought division, which is a silly division. We get oughts from is all the time, but unfortunately it's still alive and well among philosophers also. The analytic philosophers take that as like one of two things that they know for sure. But once you know the nature of a thing, you can speak about it flourishing or being harmed. And so God, as the one who determines the nature of things, is the one who determines what is good and what is evil for a creature. And so the Declaration of Independence states that right away. And it's so succinct. It has almost a poetic quality. And it teaches us so much in one sentence. It certainly counts as religion. I would say the United States doesn't have an official religion. We have official natural theology. But I think we can go a little bit further. There's a number of ways we can approach, is Christianity the main thing that influenced the Declaration or the founders? And I think although, of course, the Romans and the Greeks came in for some things about civil order, their view of God, whether it was Aristotelian or the demiurge of Plato or polytheism, wasn't operating. Another idea was operating, though, which is that humans are sinners. And thankfully, this gave us some distance from what they did in France, in the French Revolution, coming down to the Marxist revolutions, which think that you can perfect humans by changing their environment. And the United States has never believed that. We've always understood that humans have something in them that's sinful, and because of that, we have to structure our government in a way that provides checks and balances and doesn't allow any one person to accumulate too much power, because the natural tendency would be to use that in a sinful way. And so that's a very deeply Christian idea. It's different than other theistic religions, and certainly different than Greece and Rome. But you have that built into the way we do government, and it's made us stand out in contrast to the other modern democracies of the world. Maybe the English are closest, we get it from them, but again, consider the French and the Marxists. And so let me give one example of where religion can't be kept out, revealed religion. And that's on the Lord's Day. So we can't simply say that the government will just be neutral with respect to religion. It sounds nice, but the government actually has to make decisions about things. And so for a very long time, and still today, government offices do not operate on the Lord's Day. They're closed. And that is a specifically Protestant view of thinking about the Sabbath. You could challenge that as an atheist and say we could keep the government open 7 days a week and get more done. I'm not saying everyone works 7 days, but you could have rotating shifts over 7 days and you get a lot more efficiency, a lot more done. But what you'd be effectively saying is no Christian can work in the government, because to do so they'd have to violate their beliefs about the Lord's Day. And so these kinds of things are built into the law where it may not say, hey, Deuteronomy right here, but it says, change this, and you're now ruling against the worldview that's been there in our country from the beginning. Now, the most obvious one recently is marriage, of course, and then change what marriage is. So that's my quick intro, and now we'll have some good debate.
Thanks so much. Two differing views on display. Some things you agree about, obviously, like the fact value distinction is bad. We got that. Your emphasis on reason, Tim, as really the source of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. It's unnecessary to appeal to anything outside of human reason to come to the same conclusions that you find in the assertions of the Declaration, or the propositions, as Lincoln would say in the early part. What would the authors of the Declaration, it's not only Jefferson, there's a committee that weighs in as well and adds some important elements that have to do with this discussion. What thinkers would they have relied on for the purely rational understanding of the principles in the Declaration?
Well, I'll preface the answer to that by saying that the Declaration does two things in terms of a political or legal or constitutional document. One is that it states these philosophical premises, and then it makes the legal or constitutional argument for separation from Britain. And so, in fact, of course, the overwhelming majority of the Declaration is devoted to the grievances. And these are laid out in terms that are, rationally accessible to everybody. Anybody who knows the facts and the history and the law can approach those and understand those. As far as so in that sense, already, 75% of the Declaration is uncontroversially a secular document. As far as the truths are concerned, of course, the overwhelmingly important figure is John Locke. But Locke was by no means the only or even the first to say these things about equality and liberty and so forth. In fact, one of my favorite predecessors to Locke is John Milton, who I like to say is my favorite Christian libertarian, who in Paradise Lost talks about these toward the end when Adam is shown the future, and one of the things he sees is Nimrod building the Tower of Babel, and Adam says, "O execrable son, to so aspire above his brethren." And he has this great paragraph, which I can't recite, about how we are all created by God, and therefore we are all equal, and therefore you can't control other people. You don't have the right to own other people, which is, that's straight John Locke's second treatise, right? So there was, by 1776, there was two things. There was a huge tradition of classical Whig thought, Trenchard and Gordon, and Locke and Milton, all these others, whose work is profoundly influenced by the Greeks and Romans. And then there was the legal aspect, the constitutional aspect, which is rooted in, Sir Edward Coke and the legal history. And you're blending those together in the Declaration. And the part that I think most interesting in this aspect is the last paragraph of the Declaration uses this phrase, of right. It uses the phrase of right twice. It says these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And as free and independent states, they may do this and that and the other thing, and they may do all other things that states may of right do. Now, the phrase of right was in common use in English law. Very often, Parliament would insert it into statutes that claimed legitimacy for things. For example, it was made treason to deny that King Edward and his heirs of right ought to be kings of England. But the one that would have immediately showed up in the mind of anybody in 1776 was Parliament had used the phrase in the Declaratory Act, when it asserted authority to control the United Colonies, or to control the colony, legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It said we have this power of right. So what the Continental Congress is doing is it's turning around and slapping that in the face of Parliament, saying you have no right. We have of right. But in a theological sense, or philosophical sense, the reason this is important is because it shows that they are saying that morality limits politics. The states can't do anything that they want to do. They can only do those things that states may of right do. And once again, that's accessible to reason. You have a reasoned argument about what states may legitimately expect of people because they're formed by contracts or covenants whereby people surrender certain rights in exchange for protection and all this sort of thing. That's a fundamentally rational argument that doesn't depend on any claims about the mystical or supernatural or so forth.
Right. Thank you.
Right.
Owen, I'm wondering, when you look at the Declaration, there are references to the divine, not just one, but several, I believe. Tim mentioned the God exercising the three powers we're familiar with the executive, legislative, and judicial. Isn't there a reference to providence in the Declaration of Independence? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, that's right. Reliance upon the protections of divine providence.
Okay,
so he's the executive in that sense because he's executing the law, protecting the people.
I'm going to ask Owen about this because you said that basically you put forward the watchmaker notion of who God is or what God is, that he doesn't care a whit about human affairs. How do you square that? Owen, is it purely rhetorical? Is that these references to God's having a say in human affairs, that we're actually judged by how we conduct them and so forth? Is that consistent with the watchmaker theory of God?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and I think as whenever Tim mentions something, like now you mentioned Milton, it puts us closer together. Like we were trying to decide, what do we even disagree about beforehand? Right. And now Milton's my favorite too, and I like John Locke also.
I think you're the only other person I've met who likes Milton.
I love Milton, yeah.
What was it, who was it, Samuel Johnson said of Paradise Lost, no man ever wished it longer.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about Milton was, of course, he was with the Puritans against the king, but because of his stature, he was allowed to live and not be put in jail or killed when Charles II was installed. And so he has kind of this life across both the English Civil War and then the Restoration. And Locke is related because Locke's parents were involved. They were on the Puritan side. And so Locke is thinking about his parents' conflict in the English Civil War and how to solve that from political philosophy. So they're both deeply connected to the fact that the English went through this. And I think the question that you asked, Brad, it kind of still brings in our contemporary sensibilities, which is that there's this blind watchmaker, that's Richard Dawkins. And there may have been a couple deists. I mean, Thomas Paine was mentioned earlier. It's interesting that I wanted to ask about that, him being on the side of the Covenanters against the Quakers, since Thomas Paine's not Presbyterian or even a theist. He's a deist. But the idea that, well, they didn't believe in providence, I think that's just kind of or even that you asked, are they just saying this for official? Today we think that. I mean, that's what we would say when a president mentions religion. You say, well, he has to do that. But then I think you'd see these are people who believe in these things. They're different denominations, but they still do believe in these things. And the divide that we have today between reason and faith just doesn't exist then in the same way. The Westminster Confession of Faith, which is 1648, just before the English Civil War, and then it's immediately asked for. It's like the next year they get it in Massachusetts, which is kind of remarkable. They want to have this as a doctrinal statement of the Reformation. And the very first line is, the light of nature and the works of creation and providence do so far manifest the goodness, wisdom, and power of God, so as to leave man without excuse. So light of nature there means reason. Another term at the time was common notions. And the idea was that God made humans with the ability to understand the world. But then that's a comma. The very next part of it is, but that does not give you the knowledge necessary for salvation, which is only in the Scriptures. And so there just wasn't this idea that these are divided. You use the light of nature to understand the creation and to understand the Scriptures, Bacon's two books.
You mentioned natural theology, which is also, is that synonymous with what we would regard as general revelation? Could you explain those terms a little more to us?
Yeah, general revelation is a less known term now, but that's the creation itself reveals something about God to us. The works of God around us tell about the Creator. And so the content of our study of natural or of general revelation is called natural theology. So natural theology, we might make mistakes in it. We have different, philosophies of natural theology, but they're studying the same thing, which is the created world. And that's more than just the order in the world or the moral governor of the world. Those are important parts of it, but there's a number of other arguments that get not just to the guy who knocks over the first domino and then stands back, but who gets to Yahweh, who rules the world and acts in the world. Although you mentioned a few important things, that it's opposed to religion, and that meant miracles, and then you mentioned things like superstition. There's a couple others I forgot to memorize.
Mysticism.
Yeah, so I think that's been the debate since then. Miracles are a different category because that's God acting in the world, and it's not opposed to reason, it's just opposed to natural laws. But then the other ones are all opposed to reason, superstition, mysticism. And so that's been part of the debate of American religious history is, can a rational person still believe in miracles that were reported to us by what a former colleague of mine, Lawrence Krauss, said were written by illiterate first-century peasants And I always wondered, these illiterate first century peasants are writing things down for us? That's just a strange thing.
Oh, well, I would add to that. We certainly know what Jefferson's thought would have been with regard to mysticism and so forth, or miracles. When he was president, this story goes, he got into a conversation with Joseph Priestley, the founder of Unitarianism, and Priestley at one point said, "Well, Mr. Jefferson, if you disagree with so much that's in the Bible, why don't you just produce your own version?" And so Jefferson, he had spare time because he was only president. So he took out a penknife and he edited down the Bible, and he ended up with a pamphlet that omitted the entire Old Testament, included the life of Jesus with no miracles, and ended with the rock being rolled in front of the tomb, because it's a nice picturesque way to end the story. Jefferson considered himself a Christian, but he was so influenced by the ancient Greeks, and particularly Epicurus, that he believed, for example, he told John Adams that he believed that the soul was a physical entity made of atoms, and that anybody who denied this was actually an atheist. And his reasoning went by this way. He said, everything that actually exists is made of atoms, therefore the soul must be made of atoms. It must be something like smoke that drifts away when you die. And anybody who denies that and thinks that the soul is instead made of some mystical property, since mystical properties do not in fact exist, therefore that the person is denying the existence of the soul and is therefore an atheist. That was Jefferson's reasoning. So he was a natural theologist par excellence. John Adams was obviously much more conventionally religious, we would say. But I looked this up because I think this is such an interesting quotation. This is from John Adams's Defense of the Constitutions of the Governments of the United States, which he wrote about a decade after the Declaration of Independence. He says, quote, "The United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. And if men are now sufficiently enlightened to disabuse themselves of artifice, imposture, hypocrisy, and superstition, they will consider this event as an era in their history. Although the detail of the formation of the American governments is at present little known or regarded, either in Europe or America, it may hereafter become an object of curiosity. It will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods, or were in any degree under the inspiration of heaven, more than those who work upon ships or houses or labor in merchandise or agriculture. It will forever be acknowledged that these governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. Neither the people nor their conventions, committees, or subcommittees considered legislation in any other light than as ordinary arts and sciences, only more important," end quote. Now, obviously, he's speaking for himself, and so is Jefferson. And they're writing for the United Colonies that are made up of a wide variety of different religious groups. So that's another reason why they have to write this in phrases that are, the reason can access. You don't need a revelation, because that'll split the unity among the colonies. Nevertheless, I think it's indicative that the two principal authors of the Declaration are pretty clear that they're not talking about any kind of revelation here.
Yeah, sure. Because it's important, I think, remember, though, that Adams, coming out of Puritan background, they would 100% agree. The canon is closed. So no president goes to an oracle and asks for direct revelation. So that doesn't mean that they think you ignore the Bible for any input. Clearly not, because they quoted it more than anything else. But it just meant that there's no ongoing inspiration. Miracles are given to a prophet to justify that this is indeed from God, so that you had miracles in the first century to accompany the New Testament, and then they ceased. So the idea that you don't use religion, I think that's probably kind of using our idea of putting it into the past, rather than saying, yeah, you just know these things from reason. But then the other side of it is, and this really is the English versus the French revolutions, can we know from reason that man is fallen? And I think the Americans would say you can know that from reason alone. You don't need Moses to tell you that. Whereas the French Rousseau would say, no, we're really good until society shows up. And so that's an important truth where they would disagree about what does nature say. And I think I'm not saying that means there's no answer. I think there's a truth of the matter, and I'm on the side with the Americans.
The way I like putting that point is you don't have to believe in God to know that man is not one.
And it is interesting you mentioned, because Epicurus, of course, is the chief heretic buried outside the city of Dis in Dante. Right? So, and that's because he said two things. There is no God and there is no soul, only the material world exists. So Dante might say, well, that Jefferson, you're actually the atheist then, right? You're with the chief heresiarch. But I think it's interesting that this Jefferson Bible, Richard Dawkins has been making the rounds again with a guy named Alex O'Connor, if you're interested in philosophy of religion. Alex is a young guy from Oxford. He's an agnostic. He interviews Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins says the same thing Bertrand Russell said in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, which is that Jesus is not a very good person. Like, if you need a moral example, he says a couple things, but then he says a lot of really mean things also. And I always thought that's a good correction to the Jefferson Bible, who says he's this great moral teacher. If you're just looking at the secular level, probably not.
Well, I think not that I have come to bring peace. I come with a sword. Yeah, I can't remember whether Jefferson cut that part out or not.
He's calling people hypocrites and broods of vipers.
Right. I know we have some students here. Have you read Epicurus or Lucretius? Yeah, see, a lot of people don't, and it's
Jefferson strikes me as an Epicurean.
Oh, yeah, he said right out. He said he was an Epicurean, and Lucretius is where we get most of what we know about Epicurus. He wrote this marvelous poem called the De Rerum Natura that includes a social compact theory. There's an entire chapter where he puts forward basically Lockean social compact theory in the 0 AD or whenever this thing was written. It's amazing.
I do use it. My students know it because we go over Lucretius.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, I know you're trying to guide this, but you mentioned using biblical language in the Declaration, and I was just looking this up last week, but one of my favorite examples of this in the Declaration is he has sent forth swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. Now, as Professor Calvert knows, the line "swarms of officers" is Dickinson's line from the Liberty Song. Although Adams, I think, beat him to it. Adams used the phrase "swarms of officers" in his instructions to the Boston representatives about 6 months or a year before or something like that. But it was this swarms of officers, of course, is meant to invoke the locust swarms of the Old Testament. And eat out our substance is basically an adaptation of Job. That Jefferson is employing, not literally, but he's borrowing from this rich literary as well as religious tradition to put forward this claim, and at the same time rooting it in the legal and constitutional history, because he's also trying, when he's writing the Declaration, he's trying to imitate the Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights that justified the revolutions there. But anyway, it's just a fun example of you employing biblical language you mentioned Lincoln, in a way that's very Lincolnian. Very Lincoln.
I've done a lot of reading in other founders, their political writings, mostly Hamilton and Washington. And in both instances, it's really hard to come away thinking that there's an atheist bone in their bodies. In Washington's case, his reliance on the language of providence through everything he writes, most of his letters, and so forth, is evident. Not that he is explicitly a Christian in those writings, though he is occasionally when he's talking about what needs to be done with the American Indians. Then he'll mention Jesus Christ. Somebody mentioned earlier the efforts to convert the Indians to Christianity. He was in favor of that. But he, because of the providential character of his understanding of reality, I just think it's very difficult to think of him as thinking that God is uninterested in human affairs. He actually puts it at the national level. He really thinks God wants America to prosper. And Hamilton is not that different, frankly. Early on, you'll be aware of this passage in his refutation of Samuel Seabury during the Revolution, in which he brings up Hobbes. He thinks Seabury's reasoning is too reliant on Hobbes, and he dismisses Hobbes for his atheism. And you could say, well, as one of my teachers said, that's just rhetorical. He doesn't really mean that. But you keep reading someone like Hamilton, and it keeps popping up now and then. He has a note to himself that is published where he reflects on the history of the Jewish people and their travails, their catastrophes, their persecution. And he says the fact that they're still around is evidence that they are God's chosen people. He says, if you have a better explanation of how they survived, I'm willing to listen. But that's
Jefferson told Lewis and Clark to keep an eye out for circumcision among the American Indians because he thought the lost tribes of Israel might be out there in the West. He really did.
And and finally, and this what you could say this is purely political, but Hamilton's abhorrence of the French Revolution as it evolved, and because of what he saw as its root atheism, and that led to his suspicions about Jefferson, who he said drank deeply of the French philosophy. There are real differences among these founders when it comes to theological and religious political questions, it seems to me.
Yeah, 100% right. And that makes it difficult because they're also not giving us a systematic theology or philosophy. So we have to go back and kind of glean things from things they said, and it might just be that they're highly contradictory or at any moment or over time. But as a philosopher and a logic professor, what I ask is a little bit different question, which is, what do the things they asserted presuppose? In other words, what must be true for this kind of government to be the case? And that's called a transcendental argument. And the first transcendental argument we have recorded is from Aristotle about the law of non-contradiction. You have to presuppose the law of non-contradiction or you can't make sense of anything else. So I mention that because they sometimes get a bad rap for being Kantian arguments. He did use them as well. But that idea you can comprehend. What's a necessary condition? And so that's my case, is that there are theological truths, both in natural theology and revealed theology in the Christian scriptures, that are necessary conditions for this government, which logically couldn't be taken out of that. Now, practically, you might try, and maybe we've been trying this for a number of decades, but that only goes so far for this reason, which is that humans want to understand and have meaning. And they recognize, even without my logic class, that if you believe contradictory things, your life doesn't make any sense. And so we have deep conflicts in the country, politically, because we have different visions about what the nature of reality should be. And some of those are pushing away from the beliefs behind the Constitution and the Declaration, more towards a progressive, what we could just call the French Revolution or Marxist Revolution style of government. But the thing that makes the Declaration stand out is that it is connected not merely with a grievance, a democratic grievance. We voted and we disagree with the king. But the same thing with the English Civil War, which is that there is an authority above the king. And that could be natural law, it could be revealed law or revealed scriptures. And you might remember that before the Geneva or the King James Bible, the first English translation was the Geneva Bible. And King James' main motivation for the King James Version was that the Geneva Bible included marginal notes in Deuteronomy, Moses warning against the king and reminding the people that God's law is above the king. And that was used as justification for the English to have a civil war against their king. So King James wanted, let's get a good English translation without those marginal notes. But that's always been the case. So about the Bible, reason and religion aren't in opposites in that view, but instead the word of God is what you can take to the king and say, you violated this. Or in the case of the Declaration, there are truths of nature that you violated, and by doing that, you've lost your authority.
Yeah, definitely the reason this is a crucial point is the question of there must be something above the king. Obviously, you mentioned Washington, Hamilton, and so forth. What Dawkins, of course, would say is that prior to Darwin's discovery of natural selection, it was really incomprehensible to be an atheist because there was no explanation for order, which has now been provided through natural selection. So when we look back at that time, at the 18th century, they say hindsight is 20/20, and it really isn't. We're looking through the lens of things like the Second Great Awakening and stuff that really distort our own comprehension from what it would have been in 1776, right? There's a lens that distorts our view. So try and ignore that and think about how they would have thought of it. They would have said there is an order, there needs to be an explanation, it must be a consciousness. So that's where providence comes from. And then providence is crucial because without providence, then the only conceivable social or political or legal or even metaphysical order is man-made. And in that case, then there are no rights. There's no liberty. There's nothing that the majority can't just take from you, and not just take from you, but rightly take from you. I mean, you're in Hobbesian world, right? The
general will.
Yeah, or as Jefferson said of Hobbes, he mistook the abusive for the natural state of man. By the way, am I the only Jefferson fan in the room? I mean, Okay, all right. See, we agree on everything. Anyway, so that's the role providence plays, is to say there is something above the mere ipse dixit of the king, because if there weren't, then all government would be arbitrary, which is the worst possible outcome. It would be simply because somebody with a bigger gun says so, and that's no order at all. That's chaos and misery. So providence plays an incredibly important role. But that's very much different from saying that the Declaration and its order is what we would today classify as a religious doctrine, right? You mentioned George Washington. Washington, I mean, I think there's only a single mention of Jesus' name in Washington's entire corpus. And his favorite Bible verse appears in several books of the Old Testament, but is that every person shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. And he loves that image. That's his religion. His religion is a world that is safe for people to pursue the productive, what we might today call bourgeois, although that's another anachronistic term, but we call the bourgeois pursuits. That's his religion. Is we need and he absolutely believes in a providential order to bring it about. I think, no question about that. And honestly, it's hard to read the history of the American Revolution and not think the same. I mean, it's incredible how many close scrapes they somehow barely escaped. It's unbelievable that they accomplished what they did.
And he himself, yeah.
As I was going to say, his coat that had all the bullet holes in it, and he didn't have any.
There are so many things like that about this history that it's incredible that this stuff worked out as well as it did, even though in many ways it didn't work out very well.
Yeah, the fact of pluralism. And someone made a point earlier about how pluralism forces each group to take more seriously the general rights of everybody. But the fact that pluralism was present then, although to a much less degree than now, but this idea that, yeah, we don't agree on a number of these things about God, denominations, how to understand the Bible. And I understand pluralism to be kind of a brute fact. We do live in a pluralist society. We want to have education for everybody, law for everybody, but I don't see it as an end in itself, which I sometimes hear it spoken of in some political circles, where you just want to have that, rather than, no, the whole saying is e pluribus unum,
right?
Not just pluribus. And if you only have the diversity and the plurality, you don't have anything that holds you together. And the extent to which a society is aware of the things that hold them together, because it might be logically there, but you're not thinking about it. You don't realize, okay, if there is no God, none of this makes sense. So the extent to which society is aware of those things makes their cohesion more real. And so I also think the First Amendment fits in there, since this is about the First Amendment, that the First Amendment is not an end in itself either. That doesn't mean it could be a ladder that's discarded once you climb up it, but it does mean that you don't simply want the freedom to speak for the sake of speaking. You especially want the freedom for rational debate in public to come to the truth of the matter. And the belief is that that's the way in which we will all come to learn, rather than just having one person stand up here and tell us what to think and then we're done.
Yeah, in that respect, the thing that comes to mind immediately is, it was mentioned, Dickinson's letter to the people of Quebec is one of the most interesting documents, I think, to come out of this debate, because a lot of the other documents are things like, propaganda for the Americans, or petitions to the king, and their efforts to persuade those above or below the Congress. But the letter to the people of Quebec is fascinating because it's an attempt to speak to a separate and equal political society, and to take their views seriously, and to explain the American cause in their terms. And so when you read that document, it's really interesting. They say, you Quebecois are now British subjects. You are entitled to certain rights under English law, which you are being denied by the Quebec Act. You are being denied, for example, you do not get to vote for your own representatives in government, which is the fundamental British constitutional right. You're being deprived of that. And why are you being deprived of it? Because of your religion. Because under British law, Catholics can't hold office. So you're being subjected to autocracy on one hand and religious discrimination on the other in the same act. And that's what they're saying, right? So what they're doing is they're making their case in the other side's terms. And it's just fascinating to see them do that. And it's an example of pluralism forcing them to make their case in terms that are accessible to reason and not dependent on some supernatural revelation. I think the Declaration does a lot of that, partly because it's rallying the Americans together. And it occurs to me, also, Jefferson, in drafting this thing, he's trying to build toward a climax. My theory is he's writing the Declaration. He says, I got this idea. He's got this clever scheme. Now is the moment. In fact, he says in Notes on Virginia, he says, we must remember that at the end of this war, the shackles that have not been knocked off at the end of this war will remain on us and become heavier and heavier as our leaders will forget themselves and will forget the people. And the people, he says, will forget themselves except in the sole faculty of making money. So he says, so now is the time to secure every right on a constitutional basis. And he says, the one I'm going to do is slavery. And he's going to build up to his denunciation of slavery in the Declaration which is his longest and most impassioned section of his draft, where he really pulls out the stops rhetorically in this paragraph. He calls the king an embarrassment. He says the king is basically a pirate. He's worse than a pirate. He would embarrass pirates. Earlier in the Declaration it says the Indians make this war against all ages, sexes, and conditions. The king is worse. He does the same thing, right? That's what Jefferson. Of course, this all gets taken out of the Declaration, which frustrates Jefferson tremendously.
But still, he does succeed, I think, in having a kind of crescendo of grievances that begin with things that the king can legitimately do. They're just
badly done.
Unwise.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, he's being accused of usurpation, which is a little more serious. Finally, you get his waging war against the colonists. So he does at least succeed, I think, to that extent. He doesn't get the slavery part in, but everything else.
Now, Mike Lee is Senator Utah, because I hear he's bringing back piracy. Did you hear about that? And I thought, well, maybe we can. That might be kind of fun, but you'll be allowed to get what's the word?
Letters of marque and reprisal
to go against cartels in along the coast of Baja or something.
It's in the Constitution.
And so we'll see if that makes a comeback. And I joked with my wife, that might be kind of fun. She said, no, you're not. One DEI court case is all you get. No piracy.
Go ahead.
No, good.
I was going to ask one more question before opening it up to the audience for their questions. Tim, you mentioned the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. So it's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are among the unalienable rights. And you said, well, happiness was understood to be eudaimonia, which is a Greek term for flourishing, you said. So a lot of people, I think, read the Declaration language and say, well, pursuit of happiness, they just mean do what you want to make yourself feel good, right? The feel-good notion of what happiness is. Do you think there's more to it? Is it a subjective thing entirely, or are there objective standards for what happiness was understood to be?
Well, again, we know what Jefferson's answer to that would be. He says in Notes on Virginia, he says, the legitimate powers of government extend only to such acts as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to believe in one God or 20 gods or no God at all. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So Jefferson would have, his answer to that is a highly libertarian answer, that it's up to the individual to choose. That libertarian individualism is balanced out, of course, by the end of the Declaration, which returns to the covenant, where the people are mutually pledging to each other their lives, fortunes, and their sacred honor. So it sort of opens up with individualism and then comes back into a group that recognizes and respects each other's rights. But the pursuit of happiness, of course, in the classical philosophical framework that Jefferson and Adams and the others have in mind, means, as in Aristotle's phrase, it means the activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. It means to push yourself to maximize your best potentials. I think you can throw in there harmless pursuits that are of fun also, as long as they don't hurt somebody, But what it means is there's actually a legal phrase for this. It means the common occupations. The Supreme Court in the 1920s famously said that the Liberty Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments protects your right to the common occupations of life. And what that means is your right to earn a living, which is first and foremost. I mean, economic freedom is a crucial part of what the Declaration means by pursuit of happiness. It means your ability to put your skills to work to provide for yourself and your family. I mean, these colonists were laboring under the British navigation laws, the Hat Act, the Iron Act, that made it illegal. You couldn't make a nail in the colonies. You had to ship iron to Britain to be made into nails and sent back to America. You couldn't make a hat out of a fox that you caught on your own land in America. You had to send the fur to Britain to be made into hats and sent back to America, as Jefferson says, to support not men but machines in the island of Great Britain. You see, I'm still mad about this after all this time.
But also, the idea that it's those economic things, we think about it today anachronistically, meaning we think it means ontological freedom. That if I think I'm a unicorn, I am a unicorn.
Right.
Rather than I just want to make nails in my backyard.
No, because it means
you don't have ontological
it means in
freedom.
conformity with nature,
Yeah,
right? It
yeah.
means everybody has their unique skills and capacities, and you should pursue those individually. You shouldn't let other people tell you what to do in that respect.
And they're legitimate occupations.
But that's right. It certainly does not mean a free for all of do your own thing or whatever.
I had the misfortune of seeing a Harrison Ford commercial last night for Jeep. And he said, it doesn't matter which path you take as long as you had the freedom to choose it and as long as it makes you happy. And I thought that really summarizes the bankruptcy of the current view. Really, it doesn't matter which path you take as long as you freely chose it. I mean, the path of a serial killer freely chosen is a good one just because you chose it and it makes you happy. But that's the moral reason.
Yeah, and even Jefferson, who was probably the most libertarian of the founders, definitely would not have agreed with that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to both of you. Let's open it up, see if there are any comments, questions in the audience. They can't possibly have covered the whole ground, so.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions, one for each of you. First, for you, I would ask, it seems like some of the appeals to God in the Declaration are used as a justification to a power that is higher than that of the British government for violence specifically. And I guess I would just ask, like, how can you justify, or how could the founders justify violence and violations of natural rights of British soldiers and British loyalists without an appeal to a power that is higher than the British government that is willfully compelling them to do so? And my second question for you is, if there are religious principles being brought to the table and baked in to the Declaration of Independence, why then are they references to God and religion omitted from founding documents after that point?
Well, to start with, the question is about how else could they have rallied the people to fight against the British army without a reference to a power higher than the British king? I would say that they couldn't, philosophically speaking. Now, of course, remember, by the time the Declaration is written, the war has been going on for a year, right? It starts in April of '75, so there's already shooting, and the Declaration is not intended to justify rebellion. This is a common misconception. The Declaration is not intended to justify rebellion. It's intended to justify independence. Two very different things. That's why, for example, it's logical for them to cite the Prohibitory Act as a reason for separation from Britain. The Prohibitory Act was intended to put down the rebellion. If the Declaration was intended to defend rebellion, that would be logically fallacious to cite that as a justification for rebellion. But that's not what they're doing. They're justifying independence. They're saying we're no longer going to try and reconcile with Britain, and here's why. He has plundered our coasts. He has burned our towns. He has destroyed the lives of our people. I mean, it's very common in today's world to sort of snicker at the American Revolution. I think this is very shocking, to snicker at the American Revolution and say, well, we're mad about a 3-pence tax on tea. How silly can you get? And we really need to understand the history of this period to see how brutal British colonial rule really was in many respects. I mean, we're talking about real violence. We're talking about the military occupying Boston. We're talking about the British Parliament shutting down the port of Boston to starve the city into destruction for throwing tea out. Like I said, I'm still mad about this, right? So what the Declaration is saying is, look at all these things that he's done. We have to stand up for ourselves. And then it concludes, it says, we hold them, as we hold the rest of the world, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So it's not pronouncing anathema on the British. It's saying, if you'll stop trying to destroy our liberty, we can be friends. Which is, so there's a limit there, and that you could say that limit is because of things like charity and other virtues.
And sometimes you'll hear today someone say, we pay a lot more percentage-wise of our income than they did then. What was their problem? I think their response would be, you've let yourself become that much of a doormat? Don't you have any respect for yourself? You've allowed that kind of abuse and you haven't spoken up? So it is interesting when people
No question they'd be
judge.
horrified.
Yeah. It's a great question because the Constitution is noticeably silent on those things, and that has bothered many Christians. There has been, and in some circles continues to be, a desire to have an amendment which states that this is a Christian nation. But even apart from that, I think you can see that the Constitution presupposes biblical Christian beliefs about the nature of man and sin in the way it operates, and that's why it's so different from the French or Marxist outcomes, which thinks that we can perfect humans by government and by changing their environment. The Constitution clearly thinks that's not possible, but there's only two options. Then it means humans are just left to sin and misery. That's not their answer. Their answer is no, there is redemption. It's just not the government that's going to provide it, which is a correct recognition of the sphere difference between those two. And like I said, you can make a good transcendental argument about it. I made one in my presentation. We've kept Sunday off this whole time. The government's not open on Sunday. And that's specifically, it's coming out of the English Reformation and their beliefs about when the Sabbath was. And we still have it off today. And if that was changed, it would prohibit many people from being able to be government employees.
If you're really wanting to find some explicit reference to Christianity in the Constitution, I think you could just go to the very end where they say it's signed September 17th, 1787, in the year of our Lord. So, other questions? Yeah. Robert.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm just going to pick one so others have an opportunity. Try and find you after for the others. If we were, here's a thought experiment. Jefferson, much later in his life, said that in writing the Declaration, he was trying to convey the common sense of the people, right? So if we were to move away from perhaps Jefferson and Adams' particular theological or rational orientation, and just say, as read and understood by the average literate American, how would they have perceived these clauses? Would they have perceived it in an Epicurean sense? Would they have seen it in a Christian theological sense? What would have been their perception of the Declaration?
It's interesting you mentioned
if it
common
really
sense.
did.
Yeah. It's interesting you use that phrase common sense because that was very important on the Scottish Reformation and Enlightenment, the idea that all humans are made by God with certain ideas or common sense, common notions was the other one. And it stood out to me that President Trump used that phrase the other day because I haven't heard that very often in public discourse.
I think Thomas Paine wrote a whole book with that title.
Yep. Yeah, so the idea that there are just some things that we all know, but of course the fact that Thomas Paine wrote a deist, anti-Bible book about it shows that they're not self-evident in a logical sense. You can still have to debate about them and have disagreements. So it's interesting to see if common sense as an idea comes back politically.
I would add to that in asking about how the average American would have viewed it, a couple caveats. The first is that we put so much emphasis on the Declaration that we sometimes overlook the fact that it was one of a flood of statements along these lines at the time. There had been the resolves of the First Continental Congress. There had been the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. There had been local groups putting out their own petitions in favor of revolution or colonies declaring their revolution on their own. There are just a ton of these documents from the decade after the Sugar Act of 1764 to the Declaration of Independence. That's an enormous flood of literature, and so it's hard to say what people would have thought of the Declaration itself in these terms. They, by that time, would have formed their own opinion about what God had in mind for them. Also, I'm not a specialist in religious history by any means, but Gordon Wood's argument in The Radicalism of American Revolution, of course, is that we have to remember that a lot of the evangelical Christianity that we associate with this era really came after the Declaration. It really comes in about 1800 to 1830 that you see this surge in Christian belief that was not foreseen by the framers, and that, at least for Jefferson, I think he saw as deeply regrettable, as really bad development, because he was a secularist.
Although you have that influence of the First Great Awakening, in which someone like Benjamin Franklin was a young man. Some of them may not have been born yet, but they're going to hear about that influence, which also transformed the world. It's interesting to think that it began because Jonathan Edwards was worried about the youth in his congregation. They were up to no good. And so think about that, like we think today, like what must they have been doing? That God, their minister's so upset. They must have been out in gangs or something. Well, they weren't taking the Lord's Day seriously. They come to church still. But as the minister, he saw they're not taking the Lord's Day seriously. And that's what gave his famous sermon, we all know, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and started that First Great Awakening. So there is something there still kind of in the background, but it is noticeably different.
Oh, yeah, it informs the entire outlook of the period, obviously. But I think that the average American probably would have seen this as, this is a political dispute. It obviously has important religious aspects to it, but it by no means is it a religious dispute. I mean, even the Thomas Hutchinson in his pamphlet responding to the Declaration doesn't take issue with any kind of a religious aspect of the Declaration. You know, the Tories don't deny that God is the supreme lawgiver or anything like that. None of that stuff is in question. So I think the average American would have seen it as what we would today classify as a secular state.
And that's the one area though where I'd have a worry about using the phrase Enlightenment rationalism unqualified. Because I don't think the French can or did make that same appeal. Instead, they hoisted up Lady Reason and worshipped her.
Yeah, and well, you know, because the French Revolution is combining a social revolution with a political revolution in a way that the American Revolution does not. The only analogy there would be to slavery, and that was postponed for almost a century. So the American Revolution is a political revolution that has enormous social consequences, as Wood shows in his book, but it was not contemplated that way at the time. Whereas the French Revolution is an attempt to overhaul the whole history and background. And this is John Adams, again, he has this hilarious, John Adams was one of these people who likes to write in the margins of his books. And his marginalia, there's this history of the French Revolution by I think it was Mercy Otis Warren, and he writes these angry tirades in the margins. And one of them, if I remember right, he's like, how in the world could possibly have expected 5 million Frenchmen who had been raised on feudalism and Roman Catholicism since the beginning of time could possibly have erected free constitutions in the matter of 10 years is, you know, absurd, or something to this effect. So he, was particularly attentive to the relationship between society and mores and politics, more so by far than Jefferson, I think, who's much more of a rationalist, much more wants to go in there and implement the principle. You know.
And we have statistics about church attendance, though, and it was rather low, because people today say, oh, no, we're dipping under 60% or something, but it was like in the 30s,
Jefferson, toward the end of his life, said that he was confident that within 30 years, every young man in America would be a Unitarian.
Mm-hmm. Well, at least then they might go to Unitarian church, right?
Right.
But I think just regular church, and this might be a little bit qualified because you may not have a church as you're going west to go to.
Right.
But even take that into account, church attendance wasn't what we think like, oh, everyone went to church.
Yeah. Other questions? 5 minutes?
Oh, I feel like I have to preface my question with like an apology. I have very limited knowledge on this whole topic, but just the thought of if God were taken out of the Declaration of Independence entirely, but the exact same principles on morality and the call to what's right and wrong were still in there, what do you think would have changed? Do you think anything would have changed? Did it make that big of a significance that God was even mentioned? Or would it have had the same impact on people if it wasn't in a theological view?
There's two ways of answering that. The first one is, do you mean historically? Like, would it have had a different effect in 1776 if it had been written that way? Or do you mean philosophically, would its meaning be different? Okay, historically, yeah, I think it would have made a big difference. I think people expected there to be acknowledgments of that sort. You know, I mentioned that the Declaration mentions God in 4 different places, and 3 of those were added by the Congress during the debates after Jefferson submitted his draft. He included only one reference, and that was the laws of nature and of nature's God. All the others were added by the other members of Congress during the couple days of debate over the phrasing of the Declaration. So that's proof enough of how there was a public demand and expectation for these kinds of references. But philosophically, my answer is it would make no difference at all. If anything, it would improve the Declaration.
Improve it if there's no reference. See, you should have said that.
I'm an atheist libertarian. What do you expect?
But we could have had that would have been a great debate. That should have been the first thing you said up at the podium. Take God out. It is interesting. So think about this thing from Jefferson, Epicurean. Only atoms and the void exist. So historically is one question, but logically is another question. And I said that matters to us as humans because we want to make sense of the world. We don't always see it right away, but when we start to try to make sense of the world and we see there's a contradiction in what we think about it, we lose meaning. And no one likes to be stuck in that sense of my life is meaningless. So the question is, can you get from atoms and the void anything else besides atoms and the void? You can put up a periodic table and just admire it. But it doesn't give you the things that we need for government, human life, any of that. And so the materialists, and this is a Roman and Greek argument against Epicurus as well as a theistic argument. Materialists have always had that problem, right? The best argument they have, which seems to be Richard Dawkins' argument, is that, well, I only see material stuff. So, well, yeah, by definition, you can't see the incorporeal, so you're not going to see it by that standard. But that's about the best argument for materialism. But the arguments against it, materialistic reductionism, you lose all the things that make us human. So I think it would have a massive effect. I guess then you might say, well, we'll just stop with the humans. But then you just have some kind of rule by majority, I guess. If it's just humans, where do you get anything beyond the human will? Because if we recognize the human will is corrupt, then just putting a bunch of us together doesn't make that any better. There have to be principles that we agree, these are true, and I'm not going to believe them. Normally, I'm going to violate them, and so I need to be held accountable to them. And so that raises an interesting question, and this would be good to end on my side to end with, just as a thought experiment. Can an atheist or a pantheist, someone who says all is God, take an oath? Because an oath is not me saying, I promised I'm going to do really good. Well, yeah, I'm assuming at the beginning of anything you're going to try your best. An oath is, I'll be held accountable by God, who's not me. Pantheism says I'm God also. I'll be held accountable by God if I break this. It's not just I promise, I really promise.
And this is a very relevant example because that was the reason why in colonial America atheists were often forbidden from holding office and so forth, because it was held they couldn't take an oath. And if they can't take an oath, then they can't hold office. Even Jefferson says, in Notes on Virginia, he talks about this. He writes it in a sort of ambiguous way, but he says, if we think that people's religion, it's right after that pickpockets reference that I'm in. He says, if we think people's religion makes it so they can't take oaths, fine, ban them from public office. But everybody else, and he's a little ambiguous about where his own position is. Although I don't think Jefferson actually was an atheist. I know Hitchens thought so, but Madison, maybe. But Jefferson was not.
I think Kash Patel took the oath of office on the Bhagavad Gita, which is a pantheist document, so it's still relevant today.
Yeah. I think the answer to the question is that it's not particularly hard to say. Of course, an atheist can take an oath. He's taking an oath to himself and to his fellow human beings. That's not particularly challenging. The mention about Epicurus and the atoms and the void, though, again, read Lucretius. He gets into all this stuff. It's amazing. He's explaining how, light is made of particles, and he's writing it 2,000 years ago. And he talks about things like oaths and things also. But Jefferson, as far as Epicurus was concerned, Jefferson said that he was an Epicurean as far as his own life, his self-concern was involved, but that he thought Jesus gave us a necessary supplement to Epicurus in the form of our duties to others. So he says there's morality, he's imagining morality as divided into sort of two categories. There's the duties we owe ourselves, and that's Epicurus, and there's the duties we owe to others, and that's the teachings of Jesus.
And that's usually taken from the breakdown of the Ten Commandments into the first four and the second six. But yeah, Epicurus is also understood another way. sometimes it's only atoms in the void. Sometimes it's there is no God and there is no soul. But a third way is that he was particularly concerned about the superstition and contradiction in popular religion. And so I think Jefferson, but also the Presbyterians and others, would all have shared that same concern, that superstition in popular religion is a problem. And so Epicurus talks sometimes as if he thinks there is an almighty God. It's not sure how to reconcile that with other things, but he just doesn't like the crass form it's taken. And people forget how bad it was in Rome. I don't think the classical education people teach this side of human sacrifices, temple prostitutes, about the classical world. But Epicurus is seeing that stuff and saying no.
Yeah, and Jefferson and his colleagues would have said that superstition has dangerous political consequences, because if you can get people to believe nonsense without giving good reasons for it, just force them to believe in things that are obviously not true, and tell them that they have to believe it as a moral command, even though they don't actually have a reasoned understanding of it, then you can impose upon them all sorts of political things. You can say, well, the king is God's servant on earth, and then they just have to believe it.
He does, in one of his late statements in life, suggest that superstition is responsible for people binding themselves to rulers who had no right to rule them. So it goes that far with him. Okay, Professor Brogdon had the hook out a little while ago to drag us off the stage. So
this is so much fun. I don't want to stop.
I'll just end by mentioning that these two obviously don't like each other. But he works for the Goldwater Institute, which is representing Professor Owen Anderson as he sues his university for discrimination under the Arizona Constitution. So they're going to have to work together.
That's why he did so well today, didn't he? Let's give him, it's just excellent.
Thank you so much. Please thank our speakers.
Thank you.